Hello, everyone, and welcome to Insights at DDLynn Designs. This is DDLynn, a very unique twist in the art of wire, and I'm super excited today. Per the poll that I put out on what you guys wanted to see next, and it seemed to be the consensus of earrings. So I thought I'd show you a really fun way to make some boho-chic earrings. I'm using semi-precious gemstones. This is soldalite and moss agate. They're really complementary together. And up here is fossil coral and copper beads. Now, this isn't the finished piece. I just wanted to give you an idea of where we're going. This is scrap wire. And I've already started wrapping my beads, as you can see down here. And that's because it would take a dang long time for me to wrap each and every one of these beads to complete a piece. So what I'm going to do is give you the materials that you're going to need and then show you how to wrap a couple of wires, a couple of beads, and how I wrap them. You can certainly wrap them any way you want, and you can use any kind of bead you want, whether it's glass or wood or stone. That's really up to you. Now, before we get started, hey everybody, please support my page and your comments and likes, and most importantly, your subscriptions and shares are really critical for YouTube to share my free tutorials across the web, and your donations and tips are genuinely appreciated. So anything that you want to help with so I can continue these free tutorials, I really appreciate it. So let's get started. So the first thing that I've done is I have cut two pieces of 16 gauge 5 inches of dead soft copper wire. You can use 18. If you do use 20, I would recommend that you hammered it. Whether you're going to use a mallet or a rawhide mallet or a soft rubber mallet, or you really want to work harden them and flatten them out. I would typically hammer these after I create the shape, but as I've mentioned in all my videos, I'm in my in-home studio. My table is not strong enough to support me banging the dickens out of my wire. So for the purpose of this tutorial, you can decide whether or not you want to hammer them, and I'll tell you where we're going to go from there. The second thing I did is I cut 7 pieces of 3.5 inches of either 22 gauge or 20 gauge of wire. You're going to need this to create your dangles with your bead drops on your earring. And then I also cut 2 pieces of 2.75 inches of 20 gauge. Now you can use 20 gauge. I'm actually using 16 gauge here. And this is going to be a centerpiece. You don't have to add it, but I wanted you to see where we're going to go with all of this, okay? So they're similar to the ones that I posted in my poll, but I never like to do the same thing twice, so I always throw a little twist into it. So you're going to need that, and then of course your beads and stones, and I am using 4 these are 10 millimeter semi-precious gemstones, and any bead that you want to use in the center. And I'm also using 2 millimeter, 4 millimeter, and 5 millimeter copper beads. And again, that's up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and slide these off here, because I'm going to be using these shortly, and get this all out of the way. I just wanted you to see where we're going to go, and I'm going to move these out, and I will be showing you how to wrap these specifically for beginners. If you're an advanced artist, then you obviously know how to wrap. So let's get started. So the first thing I am going to do, and this is the easiest thing, and especially for newbies, is you want to wrap both your wires at the same time. That gives you perfect symmetry. You can use anything. This is a wood dowel. It is 3.75 inches in circumference. It's very big. And the reason why I'm using a bigger dowel is because I want my shape to be bigger, because I'm going to be bringing it down. And these are going to be big, long earrings. So if you want them smaller, then use a smaller dowel. And anything you have around, a medicine bottle, a cork, just use your creativity. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want a little bend in my bottom. So as you can see, I have marked my center at the 2.5 inch mark, and I'm just going to get my 6-step pliers, and I am going to right at center at the 2 millimeter I am just going to put a slight bend in my wire using both my fingers, just a little bit. And I could have done both wires at the same time, which might be easier for you as a beginner, but I feel pretty confident that I can make those look the same. So again, I'm going to find my center and just use my thumb and my forefinger and just make a little bend. And then I'm just going to line them up. I'm going to take a look at them. And those look pretty good to me. Now, if you wanted, you could put these back into your 6-step pliers. And you don't have to bend them, by the way. I want a little bend in them. And I'm just going to line them up together. So there's all sorts of tips and tricks that you can use to line your wires up, but you definitely want to shape them together at the same time. So this is what you should have. Or not. If you don't want to bend the middle, you don't have to. And the reason why I'm creating a bend is I want a little bit of a gap at the back of my wire. So now all I'm going to do is line my wires up over my dowel. And with both my thumbs, because I know I have them center, so again, for beginners and newbies, mark your wires. It will make your life so much easier. And all I'm going to do is press these up. Do you see how I'm pressing those up? And let me swing this around so you can see what I'm doing, so that I have symmetry. And I'm just going to keep my fingers like this, and I'm going to line them up. Now, here's another tip. If you find that one side of your wires is longer than the other, then start leaning that set of wires over first to create a center for yourself. And because I'm using a 16 gauge wire, I have to give this a good press. And I'm just gently pushing them until I cross them over a little bit. Now this is going to be a really big loop, but I'm going to be shrinking it down. So you'll see why I wanted to use the larger dowel, because I wanted kind of this teardrop shape. And that little bend that we made at the bottom of our wire gives me more of a teardrop, because I'm going to be shrinking these down. Obviously, this is a really big hoop, and there are girls that would love this. And let me just measure this for you. In length, this is a 2-inch, over a 2-inch hoop. So from this mark to this mark, it's 2 inches, and it's about 1.5 inches wide. So I personally am going to be shrinking it down. And again, for those of you that want to hammer, I would be going into the workroom, wherever it is, my garage, and I would be hammering the arc on each side. Okay, and you want to match those up. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both my wires and I'm going to push them together, and with my middle finger or index finger, whatever you're comfortable with, I'm keeping my shape in line and I'm shrinking these down. I'm just crossing them over until I get to a shape, and I'm going to turn them over, do the same thing on the other side. Notice how I'm lining my wires up here, and I'm just going to cross them over. Very gently, very subtle movements, because I really don't want to lose that shape. And I've got plenty of length here to create my curls when I'm going to close off my loops. And here's what you should have: 2 pretty darn asymmetrical loops. Okay, so we got our ear hoops. So I'm going to cross that over like that. So the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to line these up and make sure that they're looking even, and open that one up a little bit more. And then I'm just going to match up my lengths, and they're never going to be a match really. So I'm going to hold both my earrings together like this, and I can already tell that one is a little longer than the other. So I'm just going to line them up and very gently take that off and these off, and then I'm going to start matching them up again. And I'm using my super flush cutters because this is a 16 gauge wire. And so let me take a look. So now I can see that this side is longer than that, and it's just really matching up. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. What do you think? So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to roll these back. And this is about a ½ inch, because remember from this line to this line is 1 inch, and that's going to give me a perfect 3 centimeter loop. Because remember, everybody, I'm making some really big earrings here, so it's up to you if you want them smaller. I'm going to have about by the time I'm done, about a 3-inch ear, and this is for gals that love big earrings, that like them dangling on their neck. If you don't want them that big, then start squeezing these down more, making your hoop smaller, and then cutting these back until they're ½ inch, or at least over a quarter and under half, based on your loop size that you're going to make. So for me, I'm making biggies. So the next thing I'm going to do is get my 6-step pliers, and I'm going to use the number 2, and I'm going to separate these out a little bit so I have some working room. And if you notice at the top where I have support, I'm just pushing these out away from each other without compromising their shape. And then I'm going to get my number 2, and I'm going to make my loop, and this is the 3mm looping barrel on my 6-step plier, and I'm holding this very firmly for beginners, very close to where I'm making my loop, and swinging it back. So there's one side, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And just, again, for beginners, you want to make sure you don't feel the top of your wire in between your 2 barrels. And I'm just going to roll this back. And you always needed to change your wrist position when you're rolling towards yourself, because it's an ergonomic thing and your wrist will only go so far as you're rolling towards yourself. And then I'm going to roll that back. And I should have something like this. And as you can see, they're not lined up. That's because I separated them out. And all I'm going to do is bring them together. Now you can imagine if this was hammered on the sides, it would look really, really cool. Give some really cool dimension to these earrings, which I may do later. So now, I'm just going to get my chain nose and square these up. And again, this is where hammering would really come in and be very, very helpful. And I'm just making subtle little tweaks so that my wires are lining up. And for an example, if you set them down, do you see how this is kind of higher on one side than the other? So you can just press against your wire. You can use a wooden dowel to really flatten that side down. And this doesn't scratch your wire. And then turn it over and do the same thing. It's also hardening my wire. So these are some really cool tips if you're not going to hammer and you're using round wire and you really want to clean up that shape where one side might be bowing over the other. Then you just use your wood dowel and go back and forth. And you don't have to worry about scratching your wire. So there's one, and now I'm going to separate these out a little bit. Going to do the same thing on the other side. And for timing's sake, gang, I'm only going to do one earring because they're identical. But I wanted you to see the technique in how to make 2 perfect symmetrical ear hoops by doing your wires at the same time. And for those of you that haven't watched my videos and that are new to this, especially newcomers or new people to the ancient art of wire, and this is a very ancient art, I would highly recommend that you do each one at the same time. And what I mean is you make your loops with one and you make your loops with another. Do not complete a finished piece until you have done a little bit on each side. Now I'm going to line this up, and I know I need to bring it together. So I'm going to do that. And they look pretty darn symmetrical to me. And then I'm going to hold my loops together and get my wood dowel. And I'm just going back and forth over my wire to make sure that it's laying flat on each side. And then I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to roll over the front. So this is really cool. Look around in your garage for an old piece of wood dowel, an old broomstick that you don't use anymore. If you have a partner or a husband or a friend that has a saw, have them cut you off a good 5-6 inch piece. And of course you can get all sorts of different sizes of wood dowel at the hardware store. So this is what we should have, right? So we have 2 matching pieces. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to wrap your beads. So what I've done here, this is my top one. Sorry, gang. Just bear with me here. So we're going to make the centerpiece. And again, whatever beads you want to use. So I have preset my bead alignment. Sorry, words, too many words, running out of space. And you can set them at any way that you want. I did from large, medium, and small on the top, and a little tiny 2mm bead on the bottom. And all I did, so that you can see on the bottom, is I made a very tiny loop. And for beginners, I'm going to show you how I did this. And these are called half round nose, which means they're flat on one side and round on the others. These are tronics, and they're wonderful for making loops because you have a lot of support with that flat round nose on one side. So you have support with this flat jaw. And all I did was make this little itty bitty loop, adjusting my wrist. Tiny, tiny, tiny loop. Just curling into myself. Then coming in with my chain nose. And then what I did is I lined up so that this would be center. Can you see what I'm doing here? So that it was in the center of where my bead was going to drop. And it's just simply arcing that back, or using a very tiny, tiny needle nose in there. And then I'm just going to squeeze up that loop again. And my aim is to not have it a perfect little circle, but more of a teardrop as I start arcing it back and tucking it in. And again, for your bead drops, you're going to be using 22 to 20 gauge, and that's going to be based on your hole size. So if your hole is too small for 20, then you need to use 22 when you're making your bead drops. So if I was going to turn this around, as you can see, they're just going to drop down to the bottom there, okay? But I'm actually going to cut that off. So all I did was set my beads the way they want, because they're going to set in the center here. Okay, and then I'm going to make my loop. So I'm going to get my pliers, and I'm lining it up right above this bead. And I'm coming back on my pliers a little bit because I need just a wee bit of a gap. And these are very narrow, petite tipped, flat nose pliers. And all I'm going to do is swing my wire back, and I'm going to get the single step, which is 2mm, the first step on my 6-step bell making pliers. And I'm going to swing that wire towards me. I'm going to adjust my wrist, bring that wire around. And here's a really cool tip. To line this up so that you can see what I'm talking about, it's kind of leaning back. All you're going to do is hold your bead structure and rock your wrist. And that will line up. Let me see if I can. That will line up. Let me see if I can adjust this. There we go. That bead, or that, I'm just short for words today, you guys. That will line up that loop perfectly in line with your beads. And let me show you what I mean. So now, and my bead's getting caught up in there. This is in line with my beads. So now all I'm going to do is I'm using 22 gauge for my beads because I just felt like it. Normally I use 20. And all I'm going to do is wrap this, for beginners, around that neck. Okay, so let me adjust this. I'm trying a new format, seeing if this helps. All I'm going to do is wrap this around that neck until it finishes off on the top of that bead. And if you get off on an angle, just stop and squeeze your wrap in. Okay. So that's what you should have. Then all I'm going to do is cut my back really, really close. And these nippers, which I talk about in every tutorial, I'll have a link down below for them. Super sharp, high gauge stainless steel, and I can get in the smallest little spots. So now I'm going to wrap the side beads, and this is what I mean by getting really close. Do you see that little nubby right there? I'm going to come in there and just snip that down flush. That's how sharp these buggers are, and very tiny pointed, right? So I'm going to make sure it's lined up. And so I now have my two centers. I have my two sides for this one, my two side drop dangle beads. And I'm going to do a spiral on the sides, like here. So I'm going to finish this spiral off. And this again is for beginners. And I have already started my spiral by making a very tiny loop. And then on an angle, it's kind of a push-push. And because this is such a tiny little loop, I'm pushing the wires into each other. And I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to match it up to my other spiral. And I got a little bit ways to go, and this is what I mean by doing a little bit at a time. When you're doing all your beads at once, it's a lot easier, but as I said, for time's sake, it would take me forever to finish this video wrapping all these beads. So I'm just checking again and lining them up, making sure they match up. I'm going to go a little bit more. That looks good to me. So then all I'm going to do, and this is really important for beginners, is you need a very petite tip plier. I mean tiny. These are super tiny. They're actually smaller than my Xuron needle nose. And these are from an Italian company. I got these on Rio Grande. Interestingly enough, the name isn't on them. That's funny. All right, so all I'm going to do is get as close as I can. And I am going to bring that wire straight up. And that's what you should have. So it's nice and centered with your beads. And then I'm just going to do a little tuck, very gently. I'm using 22 gauge, so it's super duper soft. And then I'm going to make sure that my bead alignment matches. So this beautiful moss agate bead, it's just gorgeous. Can you see the color through that? Then my fossil coral and my 3mm copper bead. If I can find the hole. Okay. And so now I know that one of these is going to go in this direction. So this one is going to go to the left, and I base that on where I cut my wire off, and I want my wire to sit in the back, and it's going to be hanging from my hoop going to the swirl is going to be pointing to the left. So I want to make sure that I wrap this to where my swirl is going to be pointing to the right, because remember, I'm bending my wire away from me. So when I cut it, when I cut it and wrap it, the cut wrap will be in the back. So I'm just going to flip that over my pliers, use my 2 millimeter, which is the first step on my 6-step pliers, bring my wire around, adjust my wrist, bring that over the top, rock it so it's lined straight up with my beads, take my my pliers out, grab my needle nose, flat nose, and I want to make sure that this will be hanging in the right direction, and it will. And then I'm going to wrap my wire around the neck. And it comes around the back, because this is going to be hanging like this. And I should have 3 identical wraps. And then I'm going to tuck this up, because I notice there's a little gap down there, and I'm picky as the day is long. And I'm going to bring that around to the side, because this is going to hang right here, like so. And I am going to really cut that wire snug in. So I do recommend that you do all your beads together, as I mentioned before, and that way you're ready to do both your earrings at the same time. And then I'm going to tuck it in. So let's get started. We're going to do one earring because these are identical. You don't have to worry about one wire going one way and one wire going the other. So I am going to set up my beads. I am going to grab my earring hoop, and I'm going to cut myself. And by the way, you guys, I'm going to be using 24 gauge weaving wire. You can use 22, which I have, but I thought I'd change it up and use 24 today. And I'm going to cut myself, just because I'm not sure how many loops I want to make, I am going to cut myself 12 inches of wire. If you want to do a lot of weaving and wrapping on this, I would say cut yourself 20 inches of wire. So I've got myself my 24 gauge here, and I'm just going to stretch this out on my board, and I'm going to cut myself 12 to 13 inches. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap one side. And so I'm going to bring my wire through my hoop, and I know I'm using my left hand because I've got a lot of gap wire there, and I'm going to leave a little tail here. This is about 2 inches. You can leave even a longer tail because you might want to wrap up more. This is just how I'm doing. The sky is the limit. And then I'm going to start wrapping, and I'm going to do, because I feel like it, you can do as many as you want. My starter wraps are going to be, I think, based on the length of my wire, I think I'm going to do 10. So all I'm doing is coming in that hoop. I'm going to line these up. It looks like I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Okay, now I'm going to be sliding this down. So the first thing, and I need to open my loop, and I forgot about that, you guys, which is really good. It happened. You want to leave a loop open, not completely close it off, so that you can slide your beads up. And I know that I want this one, based on where my wire is cut in the back, to be going to the left. So my wire is cut in the back. So I am going to be sliding this over, let's see, because I want that to go to the left. Sometimes it gets a little confusing, so you just got to play with it. Okay, so this is not my center wire. So now I'm going to bring in my center wire, because, oh, Gosh, you guys, that's not what I want to do. I do these all the time, and I always have this habit of bringing these in. We're going to create a loop. So I'm going to slide this down. I don't want these hanging from my loop. I'm going to create my own loop. So I'm going to create my first loop. And this is a little tricky, and it might be a little difficult for beginners. And I'm going to get my very petite nose, round nose pliers, and I'm going to line it up right here as close as I can to my base loop wire, and I'm just going to make a loop. And let me see how I can hold this so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm making a loop around that tip. Do you see that? And I'm bringing that loop up. And this is what you should have. I want my loop, and you can have it any way you want, but I want my loop kind of, instead of your loop going in the same direction of your wires that you've coiled, I want it to go in the opposite direction because it's the way my bead is hanging, and I want to see that swirl. So that's critical. If you're not going to do a swirl on the bottom and it's just a little tiny pinhead or whatever you've got there, and you don't want to see the decorative part, then you can make your loop in the same direction as your coils over your base wire. I hope that makes sense. So now I'm going to run, and I know I want it to face to the left, so I'm going to run my bead through my wire. And I am going to swing that back over the front because this is my front. And I'm going to see how she hangs. And do you see why I now made my loop to hold my bead? So because the way that I created the loop on the top of this drop bead, I wanted to make sure that you could see my swirl on the bottom. So I need to make sure that I never tighten these down too much because I'm going to be moving these wires around to make sure I have center. So because I'm using 24 gauge weaving wire, I'm going to wrap 3 times. And I want to make sure I keep the integrity of that loop shape there. And so there's 2, 3. And then I'm going to slide my wires up. You can use your fingernails, and I'm going to make not a full loop yet. You can, just to see where my center is going to lay, because I really want this to be centered, which is why I created that little bend in my base wires when I first started. And that looks pretty centered to me. I think I'm going to push that back a little bit, and I'm going to take my bead off and do one more wrap. So you've just got to eye it, okay? Coming all the way around the back. Because when I make my loop, now I'm going to push this down. Do you see how much distance I have between this side and the center of my hoop? And you got to remember, this is going to hang right there. So based on the number of wraps. So I'm going to push this down, and I'm going to do one more wrap. So that's going to give me 5 wraps in total. And then I'm going to make sure I keep the integrity, the shape of this hoop right here, because I really want to see that swirl. So now I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to put my very tiny petite tip needle nose pliers as close as I can to my frame, and I am just going to swing that wire over my needle nose. I'm going to pull my needle nose out, and I'm going to move my wire around the back this time. And I'm going to make sure my hoop isn't too big. Looks a little big to me. And you can have them as big as you want, as small as you want. You could actually, if you're using a heavier gauge wire, all I'm doing is rocking this up, making it a little bit smaller. You could actually hammer these ends if you wanted to, if you're using a much heavier gauge wire. And I'm going to bring in my center bead drop. That needs to be around the back. I kind of got a little tangled up here. There we go. And that's given me a really good idea of how that bead is going to hang. So I'm going to hold pretty firmly right here, and I'm going to pull that loop up just a little bit more. So I'm holding the loop, and do you see how I pulled it up closer? Holding the loop in my frame, trying not to push down on my bead, just the loop in my frame. And I gave it a little tug, and it slid that loop up for me. And then I'm going to wrap 5 times, as I did on this side. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I'm going to take a look. Isn't that darling? You see how we're coming with this? It's just so cute. And I'm going to go ahead and make my loop again. And some people do this with their finger, or just hold it. And I'll give you an example. They just hold it, but then you got to squeeze it in. See what I'm saying? So I like to use my pliers because that just gives me the perfect circumference. And I need to come around the back this time. And I'm creating my loop, making sure that it's lined up with the others. Then I'm going to bring in my second drop bead, and I want to make sure that my swirl is going to the right, because the other one is going to the left. So I'm going to drop that down in there. Hopefully I got it in the right direction. If I don't, I'll just do it again. Take a look, and it is going to the right. So here we are. So now what I'm going to do is complete that with 10 wraps and see where I'm at. Make sure those loops on the bottom are even, because this is what gives it that whole dangly. If we just slid our beads with our loops on through the hoops, these would get caught up and wouldn't swing as much. So, and you'll know what I mean if you do it. So I'm going to do 10 wraps. And now both my wires are coming over the top. And here's what you should have so far. Isn't that cute? So since I have this excess wire here, I think I'm going to go ahead and just use this wire to create more coils and just complete it off. So that's 2 more, 3 more, snug her down, 4 more, 5, 6, and I'm counting so I know how many to add on the other side. 7, and I want this wire, and I have the perfect amount, to tuck in towards the inside, and you can see me rolling it towards the inside of my hoop so it doesn't catch or scratch yourself or your client. Okay? So there we have that part. And now I'm going to do 7 more here. Now, I would recommend, if you're a beginner, that when you start your wraps, if it's easier for you, do your 10 wraps, 20 wraps, wrap all the way down. Make sure you give yourself slack. You don't tighten these down super hard yet, because you might need to move your wires to find your center. So I'm like going to move this up a little bit. I'm going to push that down a little bit. I'm checking it out, right? Because I really want to see my center there. I'm going to tighten those up. This is where we start doing our tweaking. Aren't these the cutest, everybody? They're just lovely. And this soldalite, fossil coral, and moss agate, just beautiful together. Or just organic and just very naturalistic. It's just really, really cool. So I'm going to bring my wire around the back. So listen, if you are making a hoop as big as mine, this is a 2-inch hoop, and you want your wires coming all the way from the top down, you want to make sure you leave yourself a gap if you're going to do a decorative piece in the middle. You want to cut yourself at least 24 inches of wire, okay? So I would not use 28 gauge when I'm making coils like this, because you really need heavier gauged wire for your coils to support your loops that are holding your dangle drops that don't bend out of shape. Because we know earrings, they get bent, they just do. I don't care if they're gold, silver, they get bent. So I'm just going to turn this around and I'm going to snip it off with my wonderful, super sharp flush cutters. And then I'm going to make sure that I roll this in the back. We're almost done. Now you know why I'm not doing 2 earrings, everybody, because these are symmetrical, which means you don't have to worry about one side looking different than the other. I'm going to flatten down my loop now because I don't really need that open anymore. Well, I might later, so I might open it up again. So I take that back. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really snug down my coils. And I'm going to really make sure that my loops are snug down so it doesn't change the integrity and the position of them. And if you notice, that one's in the back, so I'm going to turn it around. This is the back of my earring. And remember, for beginners, you might want to mark the front of your project that you're working on or design so you never lose track of what's the front and the back, because it happens to all of us. And then we weave, wrap, or do something on the wrong side and go rut-row. Okay, so this is what we've got so far. Just darling. Darling. So now I'm going to add my decorative piece. And as I mentioned to you, I cut myself about 2.75 inches of wire, and that has a lot to do with how wide, because you have to remember the width of this is 1 inch. So you're going to need working wire. And then all I did, and I'm going to show you this on some scrap wire. Let me grab a piece of scrap, be right back. All I did is I took a straight piece of wire that was 2.75 inches. I found my center and I got my flat nose. Now remember, I'm using 16 gauge. If you're using 18 gauge or 20 gauge, it'll be a lot easier for you to bend them. And just for demonstration purposes, I just created a V. And then I looked at that V on my piece. And then just with my thumbnail from the very beginning of my V, I just used my thumbnail and I just created a little arc, and I turned it around and I created another arc. And then I just looked at them and lined them up. And you want to do both your pieces at the same time before you latch them on to your earring. And of course, you don't have to add this to make sure that they're even, okay? So that's what we're looking at. So I have 2 identical matching pieces that I created my arcs on at the same time. This one goes like this. So anyways, that's what we're looking at. So now this is the fiddly part, and it's easier to do with square wire. But I am going to mark where I want to bend these, because, or you can just do one side and do the other, but I'm going to mark them, and I am just going to loop that up a little bit more. And I'm also going to flatten this. It's got a bit of a bow in it where I was starting to stretch it around my frame earring hoop already. Okay. So if you mark it, it gives you an idea of where your center is so you know where you're going to bend your wire. So you can either have this down here like this. You decide on where you want this to be, which is why I used over 2.5 inches and under 3 inches, because it's artistic freedom and it's really your eye, what you see. You might want it up here. I think I want mine down here. So I'm going to mark my wire. And I'm going to do that by laying it down because I think I want mine down here. And I also want to make sure I'm centered. And I'm just going to hold it right there and know that I want to start bending there. And here. Okay? I might run a little short because those aren't too even, but I'll figure that out. And with 16 gauge, it's a lot harder. I would have taken this into my garage and hammered it because I want a really cool, hammered, flattened look in my center as I would want on my curves of my hoop. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this up because obviously we don't want to do this first. And I know that I need to bend it right outside of that line. So I'm going to get my chain nose. You can use whatever you want. And I'm going to start that bend to make my life a lot easier. I want to start that bend so that I'm not changing the shape of my hoop wire. And it's just going to make my life so much easier. And then I'm going to line it up here. And I'm going to go ahead and squeeze that in. And I might be using, this is where your flat nose come in, where you have a wider jaw plier that gives you leverage, especially with round wire, to squeeze it in around your loop. And I'm just going to keep squeezing that very gently in until my wire starts crossing up and over. And I'm not going to tighten down on this loop yet until I've done my other side because I want to maintain my center. So you don't want to do any tightening down. And I would then do your other hoop before you tighten anything down to make sure they're lined up evenly. And now I'm going to be using my chain nose again to bend this wire. And I'm going towards the top of my hoop because that's how I did the other wire. I'm going to turn it around and make sure that I'm centering up, and it's going to slide up and down until you lock this in. And do you see why I haven't locked them in yet? Because I need to make sure they're centered. So I'm going to start tightening this side down a little bit more. I'm holding center in the back, using my flat nose with a very wide jaw so I have leverage and an anchor to push that wire in. And that looks pretty centered to me. So I'm going to start tightening this side down a little bit more. And I'm probably going to have to get in here and cut this wire pretty quick because I want to loop it off. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So I'm going to go ahead with my super flush cutters. And I'm going to cut this right here because I'm going to be looping it into itself. So see how I want this to loop into itself? So I'm going to cut it right there. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to cut it right there. And it's going to slide up and down. We're going to tie that off, by the way. So just moving it around and tweaking it a little bit so I know where I want my center to be. So you should be doing this on your other earring before you tighten anything off. If you want to mark so you know center on both earrings, it makes a world of difference. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this wire, and because it's 16 gauge is why I'm using a very heavy duty flat nose wide jaw plier. I am going to tuck that wire into itself. Just pushing it in, like closing off the loop. And the same thing on the other side. Make sure they're centered. This one needs to go down a little bit. And then I'm going to show you a really cool tip to keep this from sliding. We're going to weave some coils above it so that it doesn't move around. And there we have it. Isn't this cool how this is coming along? So you see what I mean is that you can have as much weaving as you want. You can double coil over these. The sky is the limit. You can just keep taking off on this. And the longer you work on it, the bigger the price, because the more you're adding, the more detail, you're becoming more articulate. You could wrap a bead in between these two, which we might do depending on how dang long we're into this. We're almost an hour, and you guys know me, I am not fast. So now I'm going to get some 24 gauge weaving wire. Should have my scrap right here. And you know what? You could use half round up here and change the element of this design. Another design element you're adding to it, which would be an awesome look. So for right now, I've got about 5 inches of scrap wire. And all I'm going to do is I'm coming up through the middle. I've got my tail, and I'm going to snug this right up there. And I'm just going to wrap until I run out of wire. That's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can stop here and say, I like that, or you can say, you know what? I'm going to wrap that up. 11, 12, and because I'm working with a thicker gauged weaving wire, you want to make sure that you snug down every so many coils, okay? That's 13, 14, 15, 16. I love that. I just love that. See how we're changing the whole look of this design? It's just so dang cool. So I'm going to just tuck a little bit more in here. Try to use up this wire and not waste it. Although we know in this ancient art, there's a ton of waste. And if you look at the history of the ancient art of wire, for those of you that don't know, it dates back before the Phoenicians. It's unbelievable what they did. They would smelt their gold and melt it into sheets, then cut the sheets into strips, and strip after strip until they got down to tiny strips, and find a way to drill holes through rocks with the tools that they had then, which were not our tools, and they would slide the strips through the rock over and over again to create wire and coiling wire. And you should see, if you look up the history, the filigree work that these ancients did with the wire. It was unbelievable. Now, for those of you that have watched previous videos, I am snapping my wire so I can get a cleaner break. 24 gauge wire is harder to snap, so I may have to come around the back here and snip that off, because the thicker the wire, the harder it is to snap. And then I'm just going to get my chain nose or needle nose, and I'm just going to rock that in to the inside. All right, I'm going to do the same thing on the top. You want to make sure that where you're cutting your wire, that it's on the inside of your loop. That way you're not scratching your client's neck or ear. And then I'm just going to give these a little snug down, and I am now going to harden them even more around my hoop frame. So there we've got one side. So now I know that I had 5 inches of wire. So I'm going to go ahead and get myself 5 inches of 24 gauge wire. Was that 24 gauge or 22? Holy smokes. Talking to myself. That might have been, I don't know. We'll see. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to wrap until my wraps match up. And if you notice, I'm starting in the inside because for me, I'm right-handed. It makes it easier. I'm holding my tail with my left thumb, and I'm coming from around the outside and through the inside. Just for me, it's easier. You find whatever is the best working position for you. Now I'm going to push that down. And I'm going to push that down. I'm going to get my chain nose and really rock these and snuggle them up. Take a look and see if they're even. They're not because I'm not counting now. I'm eyeing. In the beginning, as a beginner, a newbie, I had to count every little thing. And you know what? That's what you should do if that keeps you uniformed. So I'm just going to make sure that these are lined up. You're always tweaking and looking. Flatten this down a little bit more. I love the heavier gauge look on these. You can do any shape you want. A swirl in the middle. Just use your imagination. Okay, that looks like, are we even? I think I need one more. Yep, I think one more. There we go. That looks like they're even now. So now I'm going to cut this wire on the inside. And again, these details that I give over and over again are for beginners because I remember how frustrating it was when I started. And I'm so grateful to all the artists out there that were so generous with their time. But I wouldn't hear little details about cutting on the inside or measuring your wire or where they started or how many inches down. All those things were a big deal. Big deal to me. So that's why I repeat a lot. So for advanced students, you can fast forward. And for beginners, please give me your feedback and let me know if this was helpful for you. So here's what we have. So now we can wrap a bead, finish this off. We could drop a bead from here if we wanted to. Just to give you an idea, this is for something else. But we could have slid a bead through here and dropped it. We can drop a bead on top. Just to give you ideas how you can continue to embellish off this earring. So what I'm going to do is I think I am going to run a bead through the top of this, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it. I have already prepared my wire for this bead, and I'm going to be putting a jump ring through here. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So that jump ring is going to capture my bead. It's going to be really cool. So I'm just going to finish this off, this bead. And I think what I'm going to do is just make a little decorative head pin on the bottom. Look how cute this is coming along. Isn't this the dangest cute thing? So what I'm going to do is I am going to make a swirl. And I'm going to make a pretty good size one because I've got a lot of space in there. I lined up my bead, and what I mean by that is this is going to hang right here. So for beginners, I'm going to capture this bead through these two hoops with the jump ring, okay? And it's going to hang. So I'm going to even get more decorative and make a pretty good swirl right there. And we're almost done. So I'm softening my edge because I'm using 20 gauge wire on this bead drop. And then I'm just going to close my loop. And these are great for making little itty bitty loops. Then I'm going to get my pliers and I'm going to close that loop. You can have a big open loop, you can have no open loop, and then I'm just going to do a push push. I'm turning my wrists into each other. I'm pushing with this thumb very close to where my roll is. And I'm just rolling them together. And I want to see right now how that's going to line up. And I'm going to adjust that. So I'm actually going to make a bigger loop, a bigger swirl. Now, normally I wouldn't have made my loop first, you guys, but just trying to speed through this so it doesn't take forever to learn how to make a pair of earrings. But there's a lot of detail in these earrings. So, you know, it takes time. I'm bending that back very close to that spiral so that it squares up with my drop bead. And now I'm going to start lining things up. I'm going to make sure, and this is important for beginners, that based on where my jump ring's going to be, my swirl needs to hang down center, right? And this is based on this design. If the loops were going another way, I might have to change that, but this has got to go in between here. And that jump ring is going to go in between 3 loops, the 2 outside loops and the inside loop. So I'm going to line this up and see how everything's sitting. And now when you're doing your other earring, you want to make sure that your swirl is going in the opposite direction. So this one's going to the left, so you would just turn it around and make it go to the right. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut my jump rings. And I know that I need a pretty decent size. I'm going to start with and if you haven't made jump rings before, let me know. You can use square or round. I'm going to use my 3rd step to make my jump rings, and I am going to get my wire. I'm going to try to show you guys how to do this. And when I first tried to make jump rings on this, it was really hard. And all I'm going to do is roll my wrist and come back. And I'm holding the back of where that wire is. And I'm making sure that it's coming down on an angle. I'm coming behind. And I'm using square wire because I just want to change up the design element on this. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I just need a couple. Snip that, get that out of the way, and I want to see if this jump ring is big enough. Little trial and error. And I don't think so. Tell you here in a second. Need some different pliers. Because remember, I need to capture we'll see here in a second. Do you see what I'm doing here? It's a little fiddly, might work. I'm going to rock the, oh no, it's perfect. So 3rd step on your 6-step pliers is what you're going to need if you're doing this the same size that I am. And then I'm just going to line it up. I'm lining up my jump, doing the little squiggle back and forth. And if you guys need help with jump rings, let me know. And this is what we should have. Isn't that the cutest thing? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 3 more jump rings. 2, one here, and one in the middle, and my ear hook. But look at that. Isn't that just gorgeous? Beautiful earring. Absolutely beautiful. So let's get some more jumps, and I'm going to do this in my lap, you guys, so it's faster. You don't need to see me make jump rings again. Isn't that cute? Just the cutest earring. That's why I don't like to do the same thing twice. I would get bored. I know a lot of you like the boho earring that I put in my pole. Well, this is another boho, another spin, but never the same thing. It's just boring to me. And to each his own. No disrespect. Hey, whatever rocks your world, it just doesn't rock mine. I like to change up all the time. So there's one. These super flush are so dang sharp. They will cut through 6-gauge wire. And there's 3. And I'm using square wire just because I want a different design element. And so I'm going to... Actually, I need to close off my first one because I'm going to be wrapping it in between these 2. So all I'm going to do is take my jump ring, open it up. I'm going to wrap it through my earring, loop on one side. I'm going to bring in my third or my center ring, and I'm going to close this off. And it's really going to give it a cool design element. Just wait, you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. Just trying to get close to that. Need to get my other ones. And I'm going to close this off and snuggle them together so I can hear them sliding. So they're lined up, right? And then I'm going to grab my other jump ring. And I got to make sure I've got the center one. And I'm going to come through this loop. And it's a little fiddly. See how I'm capturing that jump ring right there? That's going to be my center jump. And I'm just going to close this off. And now we're going to put our ear hook on. Look at that. Wait until you see the ear hook on this. It's just so cute. Is this the cutest? Love it. It's going to be absolutely beautiful on. I mean, just beautiful. Oops, that's the back. This is the front. Sky's the limit. Okay, let's make a ear hook. And for those of you that don't know how to make decorative ear hooks, let me find my 20 gauge. Don't know where it's at. And a lot of people have asked me about, can you use thicker gauge in ear hooks? When I first started, I did 18 gauges, and I discovered a lot of women could not wear 18 gauge in their ears. Some women have really small holes, or even guys. So I eliminated that, stuck with 20, and I hammer the dickens out of it, so it's super hard. And in general, I've never had anybody tell me their wires, ear hooks bent. So let me find my 20 gauge wire. Where did it go? So I'm just going to cut. No, that's square. Here it is. I am going to cut myself about 2 inches of wire, and I'm going to make a decorative ear hook. Since I'm doing so many spirals on this design, I am going to do the same thing on my ear hook. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is so fun, is I'm going to soften that edge. Then I'm going to get these because I love how tiny of a loop they make. And these are Tronics. And I'm going to make a spiral. Little itty bitty. Or you could just make a loop, whatever you feel like. I like decorative earrings hooks. I come up with all sorts of crazy ideas. So I've got my loop. Camera's doing some weird focusing. And then I'm going to get these guys. And I'm just going to push my spiral in. Just a little one. You can make a big one. I'm going to do 2.5 rotations. Okay, here's the fun part. On the smallest part of your 6-step pliers, you are going to take your wire with your spiral. I'm going to put that spiral wire into my pliers. And I'm going to bend back with my finger all the way up against that spiral. So some really cool tips, tricks, and techniques. You're always going to learn in my videos everything. How to make ear hooks, how to change your ear hooks. I'm not just going to make an ear hook and not tell you how to make it, okay? So your feedback's great to me. So I want you to get a visual now. This is where we're going to attach this into your earring, okay? This is going to set. Well, you're not going to really see it yet, but isn't that cute? So now we're going to stick this back in our 6-step plier, and I'm going to use the 5th step, which is 6 millimeters. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm putting this now in my pliers, and I'm just keeping it nice and straight. And all I'm going to do is swing this wire up and over and into my loop. I'm going to tuck it in even more. And here is our decorative ear hook. Isn't that the cutest? So I would go to the garage and hammer my arc really, really well. And then I would also hammer my tail. And I like to flip my tail out. So I'm just going to get my chain nose and I'm just going to give that a little bend back. And then I would go into my garage, hammer my arc. You can even hammer your spiral if you want. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to slide, find front. I'm going to slide this through my ear hook. And I'm not sure if I got front or back on this. I'll know in a minute. And then I'm going to close my spiral by squeezing in. And there you have it. Isn't that the cutest, coolest, boho-chic, organic, hippie earring? It is really cool. Let me shrink this down so you can have a better view. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. My tutorials are but long. That's all I can say. We're an hour and 14 minutes into this, but hey, I watch tutorials for 2 and 3 hours, especially from Vaughn, a gal on the internet that's just awesome and patient and goes through every single tiny little thing. So thank you so much for watching, everybody. Remember to be kind. As Thumper said in Bambi, if you ain't got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing at all. Remember to hit that subscribe button down there and have a wonderful, fabulous, magical day. Bye for now, everybody.